Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I am not in school today, so I'm just going to do this quick video as a way to get some additional context. If you remember, we were talking about caudillos in class, and one of the things about the caudillos is that it's a place where historians heavily debate, why they came to be and what their role was. And of course, there's so many different caudillos, so some historians take some time to differentiate them. And so for our purposes, we'll look at some examples of some caudillos. You had a reading assigned for today that's some background. This video will incorporate some of that. And there's also an OPCVL, which we'll work on a little bit more tomorrow, but if you can take a look at it and give a stab at it, I'll also include how to do an OPCVL in this video. And again, we'll talk about it tomorrow. So as you have questions and things like that, but we'll just use this one as an example. We're looking at the region of the former viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. So at the time that we're going to be talking about the caudillo of Juan de Rosas, we're not really looking at Argentina in its modern form. The Rio de la Plata had been a viceroyalty, so it's a space where there's a great deal of Spanish colonialism. So there's like a framework for that in places like Buenos Aires and whatnot. So the Spanish had really created a viceroyalty. There also is in 1810, around the time that Napoleon is causing havoc in Europe, there is a movement of Creoles to really dominate the city of Buenos Aires. So we get kind of a junta rule, in Argentina. So there's a variety of things that happen politically before we get to the rise of the liberal Rivadavia, and then later Juan de Rosas. The thing to keep in mind is that we're looking at a shift, and I think we talked about this a little bit in class, and it came up in the Graham reading. Some of what we're looking at from the 1820s into the 1830s is a shift from somebody who is a leader who's very liberal. Rivadavia is going to be an example of somebody who's like an Enlightenment thinker who is trying to create a space for some greater degree of Enlightenment thinking, natural rights, and whatnot. A lot of his particular interests, Rivadavia, is going to be economic in nature. He is somebody who is from Buenos Aires, and he sees a particular, opportunity for Buenos Aires. So as a liberal, he's coming into a space where he's encouraging immigration from Europe. He's very friendly to the idea of the British investing a great deal of money in what becomes Argentina. So he's really in favor of economic policies that are going to kind of strengthen. He's in favor of maintaining Argentinian culture, but at the same time, he focuses on liberal moves like education, a little bit more of a switch to secular rule so that the state becomes kind of the leader behind education and the education model. And he tries to reduce the power of the church. And some specific examples of that include like getting rid of the tithe so people aren't forced to pay the Roman Catholic Church. He's also taking over some monasteries. So some of the land, the Roman Catholic Church at the time had such extensive amounts of land. And, the reason the church is such a big deal is because, even though there had been the removal of the Spanish government and the colonial power, the Roman Catholic Church's presence and land holdings and political power, still stays. And so there's a kind of very big focus on that. And, Rivadavia is trying to break that up. So he's a liberal in a couple of different ways. And he's also somebody that we could say is a centralist. So in addition to being liberal, and that's something that the Graham source talks about, also note that he is a centralist. He's somebody who's very in favor of tying together all of the pieces of Rio de la Plata and making it underneath, one large constitution. And some of this is challenging from the get-go because as soon as independence happens in like 1816, there is a flip. Some regions start to take on their own movements for independence. So Paraguay, for example, Uruguay, which will take some time, and Britain's help in order to get its independence. But we get, a piecing up and a fragmentation of Rio de la Plata before Rivadavia is even, in power. But his attempt in 1825 is to create a constitution, and it is a centralist type of constitution. So it does kind of take Buenos Aires and make it like the headquarters, in a sense, or the capital of a political system that is going to include all of Rio de la Plata. And this constitutional framework gets created, gets written, but ultimately doesn't get ratified. And the reason it doesn't get ratified is because there's members of Congress who are really representative of the interior of Argentina, and they don't see that their needs are going to be met by this, that they're going to lose political power. And so throughout the time of Rivadavia, there are policies placed on groups of cowboys who are working for ranchers. Some of these policies are detrimental to the gauchos. They include, like, you have to get a passport, you have to get permission to leave the ranch. So there's a lot more locking in of certain groups that were starting to gain political power. And the ranching industry is growing at this time. So there's like this massive demand for beef, for hides, beef jerky, salted beef, and some of this is going to the Caribbean and some of this is going to Europe. But this particular industry is of great interest to people in the interior region, and they don't want it to be controlled by Buenos Aires. And one outsider, they want it to be controlled by kind of an insider. And so they're seeking more of a federalist model where particular political power would be granted to regions, within Rio de la Plata. And we see the rise of de Rosas in this context, because he will not only be a conservative and gather together people who favor the Roman Catholic Church, for example, and want a certain moral code. And there's examples in the text you read about how he is, kind of hardcore when it comes to ensuring that a moral code, gets established on his watch. He also is going to be very favorable to the ranchers and to political power for that particular group. He is a notable caudillo because he really develops a great deal of power. So even though there's this kind of federalist model, De Rosas is not somebody who shares power. There's kind of like a series of caudillos. He's like the top caudillo, and then there's other maybe more regional or lesser caudillos that are loyal to him. There's also many people in the ranching industry who then kind of give loyalty to him. And so you have this idea of peons and people who work in ranches, dedicating their lives, in some cases their military service, their work, to De Rosas. And so it becomes a very interesting, kind of factions of society. And of course, lots of people will oppose Juan De Rosas, but many of those people will either be killed by his group. He's got kind of a terrorist line toward the people that disagree with him. So people are killed, people are decapitated, people are run out of the society, placed in exile, and many people leave on their own. So some of his fiercest critics become those in exile. And in the second source that you have, written by Sarmiento, who later on will become a leader of Argentina, at the time when he writes this, he is a critic and in exile. He had been in exile. He does ultimately come back, but he is somebody who was very critical as a kind of political individual who had been on the bad side of de Rosas, and ultimately we get a sense of some of his perspective on Juan de Rosas. The first source that you have gives an impression of some of the actions that de Rosas took. The very first individual that's listed was a prior governor of Buenos Aires. And so we get a sense of like, if people don't agree, this is kind of what happens to them. There's like ruthlessness all around, and Juan de las Rosas gets that type of idea. He is somebody who is wealthy. He has a great deal of business, salting beef, for example. He's also owns several extensive ranches, so he's one of the wealthier people. He does try to play himself like one of the gauchos, so he kind of organizes his entire political kind of presence as somebody who is almost like a populist leader, that he is leading the gauchos. Some of what the liberals had been doing was redistributing land. So Rivadavia had been redistributing land, and some of that land was coming at the expense of indigenous people, and was going, in a lot of cases, was being bought up by people in ranching. So Rivadavia, by redistributing land, was almost like inadvertently bringing in people that would later disagree with him. But Juan de las Rosas is going to be very, very supportive of the idea of the kind of rancheros, the people who are the leading ranchers, really having a dominant say, and it's kind of their interests that are number one. He will come into spaces where he does get involved in foreign policy. He will conflict with France, for example. There's a lot of policies related to the port of Buenos Aires that Juan de Rosas will get involved in. So as a caudillo, he does kind of centralize things, despite the fact that he was against the centralist of Rivadavia. But it's really the rule that is outside of any type of constitutional norm, the rule that's built on loyalty, the rule that's built on terror. I think in that regard, that's a lot of what to get from some of the background sources. There are some questions and debates about, the necessity of him for the time. Was he somebody that, kind of snuck into a power vacuum when the alternative could have been something worse, and he kind of maintained and kept Argentina essentially together in, it doesn't become fragmented pieces, but at the same time, and that might be a heralded part of his rule. And let me just put the picture up here. I'm sorry, I forgot to flip the slide. This is Juan de las, I have this incorrect. It's Juan de Rosas, okay? The other thing that you have is the OPCVL. Just kind of keep in mind that you're really focusing on value and limitation. That's what's useful to you as the researcher. What's valuable about a source? What's limited about the source? You can look at the value and the limitation through a few different lenses, right? One is to consider the origin. So the very first source excerpt is written by Rosas himself. It's written at a particular point in time. In what way is the origin valuable to you? In what way is the origin limited? And it's useful to go through the exercise of putting all of these in, which is why you have the table created in front of you to kind of force you to put some things, in these various boxes. The purpose of the source. Really, the first source is written in a letter to like a lesser caudillo, to showcase some of the decision making of De Rosa. So, in his voice, what is it that he's trying to say, about his rule? For the leader who writes in the 1830s, he won't rule in the 1830s. Sarmiento will come into Argentina's political system much later on. But as a critic, what are some things that he says about De Rosas, and what's what appears to be his purpose, what's limited about the purpose, what's valuable about the purpose. And because you have two different source excerpts, you're kind of doing this twice. And then lastly, the content. What part of the content, you can actually pull a phrase right from the source, is most important to you. And if you were working with these two sources together, maybe to answer a question about, the role of the caudillos in modernizing Latin America, what content might be most important. Okay. Be well, everyone. We'll talk about this tomorrow in class.